You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
On this episode of PolyPat's Paradigm, we're going to talk about sex. Welcome back, everyone, and I can't really think of a spicier topic. It's not going to be as spicy as you probably think. We're going to try and cover the subject of sexual ethics. Is there such a thing as sexual ethics? Does sex have any moral content whatsoever? Is it just a sort of anything goes when it comes to sex, or do some of the traditional norms apply when it comes to the sexual activity? Welcome, and joined here by my great and wonderful co-host Eric Robinson. So how are you, my friend?
Doing well. Yeah, I'm excited about this episode that we just right beforehand decided to do because you just recently wrote a paper or working on a paper about sodomy.
That's right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Just to put it bluntly. And it just like the way you frame the argument, the way you frame the conversation seems so interesting. And I actually did a series last year around this time on theology of the body. And that was really revelatory for me, is really learning about sex from the perspective of having a theology of the body. And I think ultimately what it comes down to is, well, first of all, we live in a very sexualized culture that seeks to, it's very hedonistic, right? So it's like pleasure at all costs. And there's so much confusion around sexuality. And actually, if you propose a traditional norm of this behavior, you're seen as bigoted, as prejudiced, as narrow-minded.
As projecting all sorts of...
Exactly. But the way we see it is actually, this is the narrow path, the way of life to the full. This is God's design, which leads to the abundance of love, which is the total gift of self, which we'll get into that, I'm sure.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so why don't you frame the argument from your paper, and then that'll lead to all sorts of rabbit trails, I'm sure.
Right, yeah. So the general argument is that either sodomy is wrong or nothing is. And it's intentionally provocative because that's the way I like to be. But we can generalize. And what I'm arguing is that in order to the question is of moral structure to the world. Is there a binding moral structure to the world? And if so, how do we ground that? And what I argue is that there is, and that a proper metaphysical underpinning that can give us a very robust objective morality, that in fact delivers a very robust objective morality, is going to bear in strongly on sexual activity, right? And as it happens, I will argue that this will give us what most people would consider very traditional sexual norms, right? That sex is something that should happen between a man and a woman. It should be monogamous. It should be both procreative and unitive, essentially what the Catholic Church teaches, right?
And only in the context of marriage.
In the context of marriage, right? And we can get into all the details. And what I say is, if you're going to try and get away from that, you're not going to be able to do so without undermining the entire system from which all morality depends, right? So either certain sexual acts are going to be wrong or nothing is going to be wrong. You're either going to have to rule out a lot of the deviant sexual activity in our culture and be able to say, no, that is disordered in a way,
mm-hmm.
or you're going to have to just be a moral nihilist. So that's the position that I'm pushing. That's the dilemma that I'm pushing. There's no middle ground here where you can try and hold on to morality in some areas, such as murder or rape or something like that. But you can have a sort of anything goes mentality in other areas. So I'm very much pushing back against the sort of modern, liberal sexual assumptions. Mm-hmm.
So why is there that connection where, okay, if you grant homosexual activity, sodomy,
right,
then all the moral structure collapses? What is the basis? What is the foundation of morality that we're talking about? Is it objective norms, it like a final end of certain activities that we're talking about?
Right. Yeah. So you're hinting at it. Teleology is going to be a huge part of this. Very quickly, sodomy doesn't have to be in a homosexual context per se.
Correct.
That certainly is an extra layer of frustration for reasons we'll get into, but it could be a heterosexual act as well. Did not expect to be on a podcast talking about sodomy this morning. So here we go. So how do we ground morality, right? Morality, these normative claims that we should act a certain way, that we shouldn't act other ways. We have moral prescriptions, we have moral prohibitions. This seems very common sense. It really seems right to say that some things are truly wrong: rape, murder, incest, which is a sexual activity, right? And other things are truly good. Acts of heroic self-sacrifice, compassion, forgiveness, love, empathy, mercy. We all talk this way. We all act this way. We might disagree on specific instances of what we think is right or wrong, but we all assume and believe that there is a really objective moral fabric to the world, and that there is a sort of objective moral binding force on our lives, that people really can incur something called moral guilt. They can do something that is really and truly wrong. And in a sense, that wrongness is not contingent upon somebody's personal preference or opinion, right? There's some type of objective, mind-independent grounding that can allow us to make moral judgments that are either true or false and independent of whatever our personal fancies, beliefs, desires, or whatever have to be. So that's the idea of a sort of objective morality versus a subjective morality, which would say that it's all just a sort of projection of our preferences or fancies, something akin to my liking for blueberry rather than raspberry yogurt, right? But nobody, I'm just starting on the level of common sense here. Nobody thinks that when we say that rape is wrong, we seem to be in the same category as saying, I don't like blueberry yogurt, right? Nobody acts that way. Now, people might pretend like that's what they believe on Twitter, but nobody lives that way. Nobody acts that way. Certainly not in our contemporary political discourse. In fact, our political discourse has become incredibly suffused with moral language. We constantly hear condemnations of the other party or the certain candidate being a wicked person, being an evil and immoral person, right? So the point I'm pressing is we all live as if the world really does have some type of objective moral structure to it. Now, as we've said before on previous podcasts, and as I've said previously, morality isn't something that we can distill in a test tube, right? It's not something that we can figure out normatively through any sort of hypothetico-deductive method. It's not something that science can really tell us about. Science can inform us in some areas that might be relevant to morality, but morality is not predominantly a scientific enterprise. It is a philosophical enterprise, and of course, I would argue also in part a theological enterprise. Now, what I want to say underpins morality are two very important philosophical worldview commitments that I think are true. One of them is essentialism, and we'll unpack what that means, and the other is teleology. So essentialism is the idea that things really have natures or essences, or to use some Aristotelian terminology, a substantial form. Again, this is a very common sense view. We believe that there's such a thing as human nature, something like being a rational animal. We believe there's something like triangularity. We believe there's something like dog nature, dogness. There's something like an acorn nature, acornness, right? That there's a nature to pretty much everything. That there's an electron nature. That to be an electron involves something of a certain mass, a certain spin, and having a certain directedness or attractedness to protons, for example, right? So the world certainly seems essentialist. I would say there's decisive arguments in favor of an essentialist worldview, and that if you try to deny it, you'll just make nonsense of everything. Now, what comes with essentialism is another kind of philosophical underpinning known as teleology. That when we understand the essences of certain things, we very often understand their aims, right, or their directedness. And that's what the idea of teleology is, that there's a sort of imminent directedness or aim, an end toward which things strive naturally, inherently, not necessarily consciously, because when I say that an electron is inherently directed toward or attracted to protons, it's not like the electron knows that, right? It just is by nature. So a natural inclination, we might say, or disposition or directedness. That's the idea of teleology. Acorns, for example, if they aren't frustrated in their pursuits, are directed towards becoming oak trees, right? Dogs, if they aren't frustrated in their pursuits, are directed towards having 4 legs, having and nursing puppies, doing things that dogs do, right? Dogs don't just randomly give birth to lions. Acorns don't just chaotically turn into African elephants. Things have predictable ends. And I say ends because it might not just be one end. Things can be directed towards an effect or even a range of effects. But the world is inherently teleological. Let's take human beings, for example. We have reason, and it seems like the end of reason, the teleology of reason, is to attain truth, right? To know true things. And that reason, in some sense, is perfected by truth. And this, again, is in direct accord with our language. When we say that somebody is reasoning well, what do we mean by that? We mean they're reaching truth. Well, how can we say that they're reasoning well unless we're already committed to the idea that reason is naturally directed towards truth? And here's a reductio for essentialism and teleology, right? If you want to say that there are no essences and that everything is a sort of everything is a construct of the mind, it's a mental construct, right? Immediately you're going to have an issue because at that point you're going to have to say that the mind is a mental construct and nothing can be the cause of itself, right? That's sort of the height of absurdity. So there's at least that as a real thing. And once we have that, why deny it anywhere else? Same thing with teleology, right? If we're going to say that things don't have proper aims, well, then that means that reason can't have a proper aim or directedness. And as soon as we say that reason isn't perfected by truth or oriented towards truth, we then lose any basis to say anybody is reasoning well or reasoning poorly. And if we don't have a basis to say that somebody is reasoning well or reasoning poorly, we don't have a basis to give any arguments. We can't say an argument is good or bad. If we don't have a basis to say that an argument is good or bad, we then can't give any good arguments against teleology. Right? So you're just what I want to argue is that this worldview is undeniable. You can't get out of it without complete absurdity, right? But once you have this worldview in place, an essentialist and teleological worldview, and you can understand the essences of things, and you can get at the essences of things, and you can see that there's natural inclinations and dispositions and strivings, and that things move toward their proper perfection, we might put it, as reason moves toward truth, then we can legitimately say that things are perfected or made good or better or worse to the extent that they achieve those ends or do not achieve those ends. So when I reason well, we say that's good. I'm doing a good job. I'm becoming in many senses, in a strong sense, a better person when I learn things, because there's something about being a human that inclines us to truth, and we are perfected by truth when we know things. Now, as Catholics, we would say the ultimate truth to know is God, right? That's where we're ultimately directed. But there's many other truths along the way. Trees, we say it is good when trees grow deep, healthy roots, when they have just the right amount of water, when they do all the things that we just know trees do. If trees don't sink good, deep roots, we say that's a bad tree. That's a defective tree. It's failing to reach its perfection or its proper end. And just to hesitate against a common objection, the so-called, fact-value distinction or the naturalistic fallacy, we don't have that issue on this worldview, right? Because if an essentialist worldview is true, then to just understand the facts about something is to understand what that something is naturally oriented towards. And, in fact, what perfects it and what doesn't perfect it. So there's just no distinction between fact and value on this worldview. And then the leap here is pretty quick to sexual morality. There's details we'll fill in here, but I'll just sketch it out quick, right? We have certain faculties. We're rational animals, right? And our animal drives are sort of elevated and incorporated into our rational drives, right? But they're still animal drives. We have drives to eat. We have drives to procreate. And these have natural ends. And that nature gives us these natural powers so that we may attain the natural ends which are good for us, which are perfective of us as the kinds of things that we are. Sexual organs, sexual powers are one of those natural ends. And I don't think you need to pull in I just don't think that you need to go too deep into the science, even though this is something an atheistic Darwinian biologist would agree with, that sex is for making babies, right? That sex is, or the purpose of sexual reproduction in humans is to reproduce, right? It's to make babies. That's what it is 4. That's its natural teleology. Now, I would add, and again, this is something that an atheist Darwinian biologist could completely agree with, that there's another aspect of it, which is the unitive, right, between a man and a woman. Why so? Because the species depends upon this unitive aspect of sexual reproduction. Because, as we know, we are not just rational animals. We are rational, social, and dependent animals. We are radically dependent, in fact. Nature puts a heavy burden on moms when they're pregnant and they're nursing. It also places a heavy burden on us when we're infants, right? We're just incredibly helpless. And this would seem like an insurmountable burden if nature also didn't have someone else in the picture to assist and help out. Oh, as it happens, there is the man, the father, right? The man, the father is there by nature to be that provider. And since, nature doesn't provide us with a natural condom or birth control, nature has its ends set not only towards procreation, but lots of it, right? So if you're procreating, you're probably going to have more than one kid. Children take a lot of time to develop. And if they come in a sequence like they have for me, you're going to need that unitive bind to last a very long time. So from a natural law perspective, which we've been sketching out here, we can see how we're already getting very close to something like the institution of marriage, right? We have the procreative function, we have the unitive function, not just for the procreative act, but for the good of the family unit, and I would argue society as a whole. And so that these are the natural ends that naturally perfect us. These are the things that are really good for us. Just like a tree sinking deep roots is good for a tree. It gets closer to that exemplar of what we think an ideal tree should be. And when we say perfection, we really mean some proper actuality to a specific nature, right? So what is good for a tree is not necessarily relevant to what is good for a human, right? We have to consider the nature of what something is. But the general concepts apply. And then it sort of follows, I think, fairly quickly from there that to intentionally frustrate a natural power from achieving its natural end, just by default, metaphysically could never be good for us. So in the sense that when we eat, the purpose of eating, even though it's very pleasurable, is to assimilate nutrition. This is why we say, rightfully, something like bulimia is very bad, because we're intentionally frustrating the natural good end that even the pleasure of eating is meant to facilitate, right? Which is nutrition. And so certain sexual acts, I argue in this paper, are very much a close analogy to bulimia, right? That we look for the pleasure, we pervert the faculty by intentionally frustrating the end that is proper to the act and objectively good for us, and in doing so, whether we realize it or not, or admit it or not, or harming ourselves. We are really harming ourselves. And morality, of course, only picks up with human beings, right? So if a tree doesn't attain its end, it hasn't done anything wrong, because a tree does not have intellect and will. Human beings who have intellect and will, we can, in the space of concepts, right, choose between various means to attain our ultimate end in life, which is happiness, which theologically we would say is attained only in the beatific vision. And we can make judgments. We can make conceptual judgments over and above the physical facts, and we can judge better or worse. And we can choose. We can choose how we go about living our lives. We can choose about how we select those means. So morality is fundamentally a rational enterprise. It doesn't even enter the scene with non-rational agents. It can't. But the principles of something being perfected, based on having an essence, an end set for it by its nature. You can find that in non-rational creatures, of course. I would argue, again, that we find it throughout, largely throughout the world of rational and non-rational. But when rationality comes on the line and we have intellect and freedom of will, that's when morality comes online, because we can, through poor judgments, frustrate our own objective flourishing just by choosing poorly. So there's the sketch of sexuality.
I love it. Thank you. Yes, that's so helpful. Okay, so someone might say, okay, I hear you, Pat. What I hear you saying is that for human beings, when they have sex, there's two ends. There's the procreative and the unitive end. But why do I have to uphold both ends each time? why can't I just have sex geared towards one of the ends, so just procreative? Or why can't I have sex just geared towards the unitive and not be procreative? So why does it have to be inseparable? Why do both ends need to be maintained in the sexual act?
Right. So the answer to that has already really been explained, but it's worth unpacking, right? That nature sets our ends, right? And those ends are there because those ends are what is good for us, right? So once you understand what is good for us, and saying, well, I want to avoid that, as you've suggested, you're really just saying, I want to avoid what is good for me. And that makes no sense, right? So that it makes no sense. You can do it. You absolutely can do it, but you're foolish to do that, because this is what is perfect of you as a human being, as a rational animal. It is good for you to seek both to be open to, because obviously every time you have doesn't result in new life, right? Nature doesn't have that be the case. There's certain times when procreation may not actually happen. However, to intentionally frustrate that, to pervert the faculty like bulimia, I mean, just run the counterexample, right? Well, can I just throw up my food like half of the time, right? You'd say no, because it's not good for you to do that, right? Now, you should temper yourself in certain aspects. We're not meant to be eating all the time either, and that's the idea of virtue, right? Virtue is a golden mean between two extremes, the extreme of excess and deficiency, right? So that's why, and here's another analogy that's important, right? Because sometimes people will say, well, what about what's the difference between fasting and bulimia, right? We can tie this into sexual ethics here in a minute.
Right.
And the answer is this. There's a difference between abstaining from using a power, which is otherwise good, and intentionally perverting or frustrating that power from attaining its natural end, right? And that's the difference between fasting and bulimia. Fasting can be a very wise and prudent thing in certain circumstances. Nature hasn't made it so that we're supposed to be eating all the time, for example. And fasting has many health benefits from it, and we can develop certain virtues from fasting, and it seems to have other health-promoting benefits. Bulimia, and it's funny how much the science corresponds on this, which is sort of what we would expect if natural law was true, is very harmful physically, it's very harmful psychologically, and so on and so forth, right? So there's a distinction to be made between abstaining from using a power and purposely frustrating or perverting the power, right?
And I was actually going to touch on that because you mentioned, I can see people saying like, okay, but Catholics, I mean, y'all believe in natural family planning, that responsible parenthood. You're not always just supposed to pump out kids. You have to be responsible with how you go about these things. So what really is the difference between natural family planning, like going off the woman's cycle and abstaining from sex, versus just using contraception and still having sex? And I think you hit it with that analogy, really. Well, it's the difference between fasting and bulimia. And what we're talking about is the actual act. You have to maintain the ends in the act. That doesn't mean that we always have to be procreating. In other words, that doesn't mean we always have to be having sex. It's just that when we do, it needs to be open to life and procreative and unitive in the act. But that doesn't mean we always have to be acting.
And if you were constantly having sex, we'd probably think that there was something wrong.
Right. Just like a glutton constantly eating, like you mentioned.
Right. So yes, we have to talk about whether we are in the act itself. That is a critical distinction. And I want to say a few more things about, the difference between natural family planning and say the pull-out method or other, like sodomy or stuff like that, is in principle very similar to the difference between fasting and bulimia, right? And once you can make those connections, I think that's important, because I think in our culture, people still see bulimia as wrong, even if they've lost the ability to see, because of all the sexual confusion, why something like contraceptive acts or sodomy would be wrong. And what I want to argue is that for the same reasons that you acknowledge something like bulimia is wrong, these natural law underpinnings are going to bear heavily on the sexual activities as well, right? Because we have these various powers which are oriented towards various ends, which are properly perfective of us, right? And that's the thing. My argument is it's an all or nothing affair, right? You can't pick and choose where you want moral import, right? You're going to have moral import all the way through, or you're not going to have it at all, right? That doesn't mean we can't be wrong in certain applications. Sometimes when we're thinking through natural law applications, it can get very subtle, very naughty. I would argue sexual ethics is not one of those cases. It's pretty cut and dry. Now, for natural family planning, I also want to be clear. I think some Catholics misunderstand this. Like, that's not something that like you're normally, should be thinking about, right? You should only engage natural family planning if you have some strong overriding reason to do it.
It has to be very serious reasons, like very serious, and otherwise, you're called to continue to go normally into the sexual union and not just abstain for the sake of abstaining or for flippant reasons. It has to be very serious reasons that a couple decides, okay, for whatever reason, we need to space out the births a little bit more, so we're going to practice self-restraint and do natural family planning in that way.
Right, yeah, and there's the church provides guidance, and philosophy can as well, on what might legitimate using the so-called rhythm method, which of course nature provides a certain rhythm, right? Yeah. So that's the idea there. I would just say that people grossly misapprehend when that criteria actually applies, right? Like,
right.
Like economic hardship. Nah, bro. You're not in economic hardship, right? Look how many kids grandma brought up and their economic hardship, right? And like, I don't mean to be like rude or condescending, because this is something that me and my wife had to deal with, right? Because first off, my sexual ethics were uber liberal before I became Catholic, right? So like, we don't need to get into all that business, but let's just say that I didn't believe or even think about sex at all in the way that I do now, right? So this is something I've changed my mind on. But even as we were becoming Catholic and I started to really think through and realize, wow, the church is right on this, boy, did we have to change our lifestyle and our attitude. So this was something that, and now we have 4 kids, right? And we're totally open, God willing, to give us more. And let me just say how good it has been, right? And I think this shows the predictive success of traditional natural law, because, not to get overly gory or personal here, but I think it's important is like, I was, and I think this is something that guys will relate to, extremely selfish in the sexual act for most of my life, right? And this is part of the problem, I think, with a lot of contraception and stuff like that. You start to see another person as a means rather than an end, right?
Yes.
You really just start to see them as a masturbatory device, fundamentally. And you can see how this can really screw with the unitive function, the really emotional bonding function, when you just see them as some way of getting off, right? And that is something that is real and true. It certainly was in my experience. And having to temperance, one of those cardinal virtues, my sexual appetites, and having to use reason to guide my sexual appetites, has made me, I can say, a far better husband and father. It has also given me more children and more opportunities to sacrifice in other ways where I was previously very selfish, right? And let's be frank, the attitude of the culture these days is I don't want to have children because I don't want to have children. I don't want to sacrifice, right? And what is that doing to people? So, I mean, these are kind of like the extended negatives, around this sort of contraceptive mentality. It's building a pride. It's building a narcissism. It's blocking opportunities for grace, blocking opportunities for charity. So there's a lot of different connections here that are incredibly important. But I just want to say this is something that, I struggled with. I had to deal with it. It had immediate practical consequences on my life where, both me and my wife had to make some significant changes on, how we thought about our family, the potential size of our family. And difficult at first, absolutely. Worthwhile, 100%.
It's interesting, Pat, is that really what we've talked about so far, an atheist could affirm, right? Like, I mean, as far as this is a philosophical argument for morality. Maybe not an atheist, but someone who's not Christian could affirm this. So what are your thoughts about that? And like, why don't more people that aren't Christians adopt this sexual ethic? Or maybe some do. Like, I'm sure.
So there are Aristotelian naturalists, right? So there are people who are atheists who affirm a sort of broadly Aristotelian worldview, which is what I've been describing, and would affirm the sexual moral norms that I've been putting out there. So it's something an atheist could, in principle, could accept.
And
and I would say that's sort of a minority camp, because I think once you put essentialism and teleology on the table, there's no way to sustain that without a divine organizing mind, right? So it's just, I just don't think it's a sustainable atheistic project. Now, it's useful because you can talk about morality in a way where you don't have to just point to Scripture, right?
Exactly.
You can, and I don't even think I brought up God once in this conversation, as far as I'm concerned, right?
Right.
And that should be very attractive to secular. Like, it was a purely philosophical argument, and I didn't mean not to mention God. It just so happens that I didn't bring God up, right?
Right.
So no, your point is a good one. It's something an atheist could totally accept. I would say at the end of the day, once we go deeper into the metaphysics, theism is going to be the only thing that can sustain that worldview at the end of the day. But I would argue theism is true regardless. So you might as well accept that worldview. So yeah, you're right. That is an Aristotelian naturalist not only would, but I hope not only could, but I hope would follow those conclusions through to a similar end on sexual ethics.
Yes, and I really just real quick want to quote something from Humana Vitae and then Familiaris Consortio, 2 documents from the Catholic Church that have to do with contraception, really. Humana Vitae says, every action which, whether in anticipation of the conjugal act or in its accomplishment or in the development of its natural consequences, proposes, whether as an end or as a means to render procreation impossible, is intrinsically evil. And then Familiaris Consortio, he really describes, and I love the language JP2, St. John Paul II, uses here to describe really the difference between contraception, natural family planning. He says, thus, the innate language that expresses the total reciprocal self-giving of husband and wife is overlaid through contraception by an objectively contradictory language, namely that of not giving oneself totally to the other. This leads not only to a positive refusal to be open to life, but also to a falsification of the inner truth of conjugal love, which is called upon to give itself in personal totality. The difference, both anthropological and moral, between contraception and recourse to the rhythm of the cycle involves in the final analysis 2 irreconcilable concepts of the human person and of human sexuality.
Always beautiful to read.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, right.
And that's where it comes down to, is that, yes, our natural end is God. God is love. Love is the total gift of self. Our destiny as human beings is to give ourselves totally to God as he gives himself totally to us. And our destiny and our whole life is purposed around this love, this giving of ourselves. And in marriage and between the members of the opposite sex, that manifests in a marriage where the husband gives himself totally to the wife gives herself totally to the husband, and out of that springs forth new life. Right. Then you give yourself totally, it's just this total gift of self, and the family unit becomes this image and likeness of the Trinity. And so it's already imitating, showing the world what our final end is, like what we're going towards. And so when we use contraception or direct sterilization, which is a permanent form of contraception, we are cutting off from that image and likeness of the Trinity. We're cutting off life, and we're going against God's design. If God didn't want you to be that way, he wouldn't have designed you that way.
Right. And, I want to just hedge off a potential objection right now, because people say, well, what if you have a medical condition and you need to have some procedure done that will, render you, infertile or sterile? And natural law can handle that. We have something called the principle of totality. And if your whole system is threatened by any one of its parts, it's better to preserve your whole, right, and remove one of its diseased or decayed parts, because if you die completely, then there's no way that you're going to continue on your flourishing, right? So examples like a system that can handle those objections, trust me. Because you're right. You put this position out in today's culture. People say how mean-spirited, how bigoted. What about people's desires? Just so much more that needs to be said. And if this worldview is correct, which I believe it is, we're really just saying that a rational person who is apprised of all the relevant facts will see what is really and truly good for them and just make these same conclusions, right? So it's just a matter of just acting reasonably and responsibly according to the moral rule based on the ends that are set for us by nature, which are objective and unchanging, immutable, right?
Yes.
And just as, somebody can be born with a physical defect, a common example would be given clubfoot, right? It means that there's something that's falling short of the standard. There's a disorder, a defect, and we treat, right? So I would argue we need essentialism to make sense of medicine, right? If we don't have an idea of a norm or a range of a norm, like medicine's gone. Like medicine
Right.
is so there's just a practical effect there. Well, just as, certain physical things can be disordered either by birth or, through habit or vice, same thing with mental disorders and desires. Yes, people can have disordered desires. We very frequently do, not just with relation to sex. But a person's subjective desires do not determine what constitutes their objective flourishing. That's the point. And when our desires are disordered, so that's what we mean when we say that a certain sexual act is disordered. It's teleological language. It's ordered away from its proper end, right? Same thing with a desire that is disordered. It's ordered away from its proper end. And we all struggle with temptations and vices, some of us to various degrees. And just because an act is bad for us or wrong, another distinction to make is that it doesn't mean automatically that we're always culpable for it. There might be underlying mechanical, physiological reasons that would alleviate culpability for someone, right? So just drawing distinctions between responsibility and culpability. So just because we would say that somebody is doing something wrong, we're not automatically saying they're culpable for that, right? They might be. But in a theological sense, we know that a perfect God judges justly at the end of the day. So we don't have to really worry about that. But we can still objectively say, no, that action is wrong. That action is disordered, regardless of whether somebody desires it or not. So I just wanted to throw those couple points in.
Now, one thing that I really appreciate about the church's teaching, which is rooted in scripture and philosophy here, with the natural law, about the inseparable connection of procreation and the unitive aspects in the sexual act, is that it makes sense of so much and provides so much clarity over what is wrong and what is right. Basically, anytime you separate procreation and the unitive aspects, anytime you separate that, it's wrong. It's immoral. It's not God's design. And thus, homosexual acts are wrong, masturbation's wrong, pornography's wrong, and there's no confusion there. It's like, so that can be such a great filter of like, is this act that is ordered towards procreation and union of husband and wife, is it something else? Is it
right,
or disordering that? And so real quick, I just wanted to read what the Catechism says about homosexuality, since we were talking about sodomy earlier, which once again could be heterosexual couples practicing that. So it's equally bad there. But this says homosexuality...
Well, maybe not, right? Because if it's between heterosexual couples, you still have a man and a woman, right?
Yeah. Well, it's still bad, but it's maybe not equally bad. Yeah.
Right, yeah. So go ahead, sorry.
So homosexuality refers to relations between men or between women who experience an exclusive or predominant sexual attraction toward persons of the same sex. This is paragraph 2357. It has taken a great variety of forms through the centuries and in different cultures. Its psychological genesis remains largely unexplained. Basing itself on sacred scripture, which presents homosexual acts as acts of grave depravity, tradition has always declared that homosexual acts are intrinsically disordered. They are contrary to the natural law. They close the sexual act to the gift of life. They do not proceed from a genuine affective and sexual complementarity. Under no circumstances can they be approved.
Right.
Now, the Catechism goes on to say, the number of men and women that struggle with this is not negligible, and so this constitutes for them a trial. Like, we all have disorders of some kind. We all have sin struggles, so we have to fight them, and it's hard. And so for them, it says this: they must be homosexuals or people that have those tendencies must be accepted with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. Every sign of unjust discrimination in their regard should be avoided. These persons are called to fulfill God's will in their lives, and if they are Christians, to unite the sacrifice of the Lord's cross, the difficulties they may encounter from their condition. And so homosexual persons are called to chastity by the virtues of self-mastery that teach them inner freedom, at times by the support of disinterested friendship, by prayer, sacramental grace. They can and should gradually and resolutely approach Christian perfection. And that's the good news. Like, we're all called to be saints. We're all called to be chaste. married couples called to be chaste, which that's interesting. But yeah, so any comments on that? And I would like to dig into a little bit more about chastity within marriage as well.
Right. So, people will say, yeah, you get the slogans and the rhetoric, which is really unhelpful of, hey, it's none of your business to be in people's bedrooms, and why are you so obsessed with other people's sex lives? Sometimes people will throw that one out, right? Or why are you such a bigot? And the idea is it's not that at all, right? The idea is because I'm trying to figure out the structure of the world, right? I'm trying to figure out the moral import. And both philosophy and revelation converge on the same point. And they say, and let's just remember, right? Sexual ethics is one page in the book of morality, right? It's one that, of course, the church gets a lot of attention on because in our contemporary culture, it's such a hot topic. But it's not like people think the church obsesses about sex. No, people obsess about sex, right? And it just gets more attention. The church has a lot to say on the moral life in general. Sex is an important part, but it's not the only part. And if you care for somebody, to love somebody is to will what is really good for them. Mm-hmm. And if it turns out that certain acts are not really good for someone, then you're not being caring by encouraging or enabling them to carry on those acts. So it at best begs the question to just insult somebody because they say, look, I think this act is not good for you. And when we use evil, remember, evil in the tradition means a privation. It's something missing that otherwise should be there. It's a failure of some sort. And this is why terms like modern moral terms like value and stuff like that are not really helpful. The classic thinkers use terms like the good, right? And I think that's a lot better way to think about it, the good. And then an evil is something that falls short. It's something missing the mark, right? A hole in the sock, right? A non-consideration of the moral rule, blindness in Grandma Betsy, some stuff like that, right? So yes, there's something missing here. There's something disordered. There's a lack of order that otherwise is good for you, perfected for you. So it is not caring, regardless of what the culture says, to not be honest and say, look, I think these actions, just like you would want to be honest about any other action, people taking drugs, right? Abusing drugs, abusing alcohol. Doesn't matter what their desires are. You say, look, I really don't think this is good for you. And it's because I care for you. It's because I love you as my moral obligation that I don't want you to do this. And I want to help you. Because as you said, Eric, we all struggle with things, right? And we all have our cross, as the saying goes. And some people have, a heavier sexual cross than others. Other people have crosses in other areas. We all got something, right? We all have something. So I just think it's very lame to just exclude certain crosses for just purely cultural reasons when philosophy and theology and divine revelation say otherwise. And to be very clear, what I've argued here is not something that is exclusively by any means Christian. You have classical, thinkers stretching back to the great ancient Greek thinkers who reached the same conclusions or very similar conclusions as well. As the church has said, the church didn't invent the natural law, God did. The church just upholds it, protects it, and affirms it. So it's just, I just want to emphasize that. It's not, and I almost hate to dignify accusations of bigotry with comment because they're just such low blows. But to love somebody is to will the good of the other because they are other. And to will the good of the other requires an understanding of human nature and what human nature's ends are, what is perfective of human nature, and then trying to facilitate a person in the good and trying to prevent a person from frustrating their own flourishing. So sexual acts have a lot to do with that, right?
And this is interesting because towards the end they're talking about chastity, and chastity is the successful sexual integration within the person. And it's an apprenticeship in self-mastery, the Catechism says. And I love that phrase, an apprenticeship in self-mastery, which is where our true freedom lies. So we don't want, we have intellect, we have will, we have passions. We don't want our passions to overrule our will or our intellect, or else the passions are controlling us. Right. We want, through our intellect, to be moved by the will to have dominion over our passions so that we are not being enslaved, but we have true freedom to make moral choices and judgments and all of that. And therein lies the battle, right? Because oftentimes the passions are very strong, and we have to continually fight the flesh according to Scripture. Like, we have to do battle against the flesh and overcome that so that they can be rightly ordered. Right, and so what's interesting is, I think in a lot of Christian circles, I at least had never heard of this concept until becoming Catholic, of chastity within marriage. Of course, if chastity really is the successful integration of one's sexual life within the person, and it involves self-mastery, then of course, if you reject contraception, you go and also just upholding the procreative and unitive aspects of sex, then it would make sense that you have to have chastity within marriage. You have to have some self-restraint at times. And so maybe talk a little bit about that. Like, what does chastity within marriage look like? And do you think it's even harder within marriage sometimes to be chaste than someone who's single and it just says no all the time to sex because, like, sex is for marriage? And so, I'm kind of curious about that.
Yeah, there was one other point I wanted to bring up too as you were chatting, but it just leapt out of my mind. So I'll try and circle back around to that. Hopefully it comes back. It was a good one. It's going to be groundbreaking.
Oh man,
totally. Dang it. Yeah, gone. Chastity and marriage. Well, first off, importantly, and this doesn't get talked enough about either, is we have something in I would argue through natural law, but certainly the church has affirmed this, is the idea of the marriage contract, right? And the marriage contract is that when you give yourself completely over to somebody, that there is, an obligation to fulfill the marriage contract, right? So it's not legitimate if, your partner is, wanting to, engage in the marriage contract to just constantly say, I'm too tired tonight. I'm sorry, right? That's not living up to your spousal obligation. That doesn't mean there can't be legitimate reasons why you would want to refrain. And that's where the idea of chastity comes in too, right? And I think that's the thing, right? If you're, that's the point I wanted to make, is the idea of the lower powers and the higher powers. So as rational animals, this will tie in nicely, right? I think, or I'll try to make it tie in nicely. All of our lower powers are clearly necessary for, but also subordinated to our higher powers. Like, we need to eat and we need to have shelter. These things are good for us. It's very bad if we don't get these things. But they're also subordinated to and meant to facilitate our higher powers, our rationality, right? To know the truth about the world, to know and love ultimately God, I would say. So they participate in our rationality. They are elevated by our rationality. And to your point, Eric, they are meant to be governed by our rationality, right? If we are governed by our passions and our lower appetites, the animal appetites, there's language that reflects this. That is quite right. Like, hey man, stop being such a pig. Stop being such a dog, right? It's lowering ourselves to something less than human. It's frustrating our flourishing as the type of thing we are meant to be when we let our sort of animalistic appetites completely overrule our rationality or reason. That's an inversion, and that is inherently bad for us. So we definitely don't want to say that the lower appetites are bad. Food, good. Shelter, great. Sex, fantastic. Mm-hmm. But participating in, subordinated to, and guided by the higher power, which is, of course, being animals possessed of intellect and will as well. So this plays in kind of what you're talking about, right? Is, as a husband, I have to try and understand that the love for my wife is critically important. I often, like anybody else, I often fail. I often enrage my wife, right? If people haven't got it already, I'm an inherently annoying person. I'm doing my best, right? So, I have to restrain myself. I do have to try and be chaste for the good of my wife. Like, if she's utterly exhausted and she's run down, and I'm just like, come on, honey, kids are in bed, right? And I'm just go. And I have to think about how this is, not only not respectful and good for my wife, when I should at least be chatting with her, maybe giving her a foot massage, trying to help her out with some things. It's also making me more selfish by not practicing a certain degree of restraint. Chastity as well, right? You can see how I'm starting to veer more towards this narcissism and self-servingness and all that. So there's a balance here, right? You want to uphold the marriage contract and understand that you have made this commitment to another person to be open to life and to procreate with them. And that's a good thing, right? Like, sex should be fully enjoyed, right? It's an analogy is like, it's like a fire. You just want to keep it in its right place, the fireplace. If you let it out all over the place, it wreaks havoc. But where it in its proper place, it's a beautiful thing. It's a warming thing. Good. It's a great thing. But there's also just other dynamics at play where, yes, you have to practice chastity. You have to practice restraint for the good of the other person and for the good of yourself. And that's the idea of the moral life, of the virtuous life, is that when you will the good of the other, you are willing the good of yourself, right? It's not mutually exclusive. You become more loving. You become more perfected. It is not good for us to be selfish, narcissistic, prideful. These are eventually capital sins, right? Really, really bad stuff. So yes, like you often hear in the Catholic life, it's a both and, right? So there is the marriage contract. That's a good thing, but there is just love and care for the other person, which requires temperance, restraint, chastity, all that.
Well, I think that's a great spot to end, and just an encouragement for everyone out there. Jesus says he came to give life and life to the full. And JP2 said, freedom is not to do whatever you want. It's to do what you ought. And it is for freedom Christ says free. And I think all of this, like when you actually go into the design and live by God's design, which I'm speaking to myself here too, like I need to do this as well. Like whenever I've done that, when I've lived by God's design, it is life to the full. Whenever I go against it, it's not. Even though it maybe in the short run, it may seem like it or something, like I'm getting some sort of pleasure out of something. But in the long run, it's not. And it's actually harmful for me and for whoever it's affecting. Right. And so any last words there, Pat? Yeah,
it's this idea of freedom for excellence. And I think it's absolutely correct, right? Wow. So freedom is not just this idea of autonomous self-direction, right? Of just going over, being just wherever your desires take you. But the problem is, like, people realize that isn't freedom, right? Because people can have desires that they know enslave them, like addictions, like vice, right? So it can't be that, right? And a helpful analogy is this idea of, like, if you bind a plant down from, growing towards the sun or the way plants naturally do, you say, hey, that plant isn't free, right? Why? Because it's not doing what it naturally would. Same thing. This is the idea of the idea of freedom is attained through a certain excellence of doing what we ought. Same thing. We can bind ourselves down. We can restrain ourselves and restrict our own flourishing through vices, through addictions, through just consistently poor moral decision-making. Yes, in a secular sense, you think that you're free because you chose to do it, at least at first, until that becomes habituated, and then you're not. You wish you didn't or couldn't choose it anymore, right? But that's a totally wrong way to think about what freedom is. Freedom for excellence, freedom for flourishing, is being the best kind of expression of the type of thing that we are as rational animals, which means here's the final point, right? Finding our true happiness, right? We all act for our own happiness. There's nothing that escapes this, right? We all want to be happy. Every decision we make, we do it because we think, either rightly or wrongly, it will make us happy. Even miserable decisions. Even the person who commits suicide, God save them, does so because they think they would be better off dead. Now, we would argue that they are mistaken, but they still make that decision because they think that would make them better off, right? So we're pursuing happiness. And then the question is, the critically important question is, what makes us happy? Or what causes us to flourish? Eudaimonia, as Aristotle would say. And the answer is understanding our nature and fulfilling the ends that nature sets for us. So if you want to be happy, you should follow the dictates of the natural law. But we all do want to be happy. We can't escape that. So what's the hypothetical, to use Kantian language, assumes a categorical force because the conditional cannot be escaped. We all do want to be happy. Therefore, we should all follow the dictates of the natural law. And that is how, not to just be most happy, but also most free. And
that reminds me of something, I think this was C.S. Lewis who had the analogy of people are playing in mud puddles when they could be swimming in the ocean. I think that's what God sees, is like, come on, guys, stop playing in mud puddles. Like, I have this whole ocean, and it's awesome. And I'm also reminded of St. Irenaeus' quote, and I'll close with this. St. Irenaeus said, "The glory of God is man fully alive." and the glory of man is the vision of God. And that's what God wants to do. He wants to make us fully alive, and that gives him glory when we're fully alive. And when we're talking about sexual ethics, we're talking about things that make us fully alive. And so the glory of God is being fully alive, and the glory of man, our glory, is when we see God face to face, love himself, joy himself, peace himself. We see God, truth himself, and we're fulfilled in that beatific vision to which we're journeying on. So thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks, Pat, for your amazing comments, and just is a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.